Welcome to Podcast Done For You, the show where we make it as easy as possible for you to make the right choices to advance your podcasting career. So let's get started on the show.
Well, here's a question I'm often asked. How do you define your podcast audience and speak directly to them, specifically in 2026 when so many things are changing? We're going to go through a few things today about defining them, your ideal audience, who they are, what engages with them, how to speak to them, and some common mistakes to avoid. There's going to be an exercise at the end, so please stay tuned. You don't want to miss any of this valuable information. Because if you are thinking about a podcast at the moment, I'm going to guess that you're a business owner or a CEO of a business that is doing okay. You've been in business for a little while. You're hitting that point where you want to grow and you want to do more, but you're not quite there yet. Well, this is the place for you. What we're going to talk about is understanding your audience first of all. And let me ask you this question. As a business owner or a CEO, have you sat down and worked out who is your audience? Now, I know from experience that there's a pretty large percentage of people that haven't done this exercise. If you have, kudos to you. You might want to stay tuned for a little bit of information to see whether you can beef that up a little bit further. If you haven't, don't worry about it, because that's what we're here to do. And that's part of what the exercise will be at the end of this episode. So what I want to talk to you about firstly is defining your audience. And the way to define your audience is think about your ideal client. Who is it? Because you want to speak to them and make sure you're not speaking to the people who are less than ideal. The more that you speak to those ideal people, the better off you are. Let me give you a quick example. At the start of this, I referred to business owners and CEOs of established businesses who employ people. Now, that is my ideal audience as a starting point for the definition. Now, that doesn't mean if you're outside of those parameters, don't worry, stay tuned. I may be able to help you. And even if I can just help you through the podcast, that's great. But that's who my ideal audience is. You need to understand who they are and start to define them. Now, there are people that will sit outside of those parameters that you will help, some you won't, but focus on the ideal client. Maybe that it's an amalgamation of 2 or 3 different people. Either way, suggest you give them a bit of a name and start thinking more and more about them as you start to design how you're going to talk in your podcast. Now, one of the things that is really important to do, and I've said this in previous episodes of the podcast, you've got to speak to people directly. I'm talking to you right now. Now, you need to feel like I am talking to you. You need to understand that this is for you. You are not a fly on the wall here as such, that this is you nodding your head going, yes, this is me. I'm understanding what is being said here. And that's what you want to achieve as the host of your podcast. You want to make sure that your ideal client is sitting there and is paying attention to what you are saying, because you are delivering gold for them. But more importantly, you're talking to their pain points. You're talking to what they need, what is going to make their life better as a result of having listened to your podcast and potentially going further and wanting to engage with you and your brand in more detail. Now, once you have your ideal client and you are speaking to them directly, think about the tone that you use. Think about the values that you give over and the language that you use. What do I mean by that? And think about it in these terms. When you go home and you speak to your children, and they may be youngish, you're going to speak to them in a very different way to the way you're speaking to your colleagues at work. If you are in a boardroom situation, you're going to speak very differently again. If you go to the football and you're among a few mates, you're going to speak differently again. My question for you is, how do you need to speak to your audience? You need to make sure that it is the kind of language, the values that you would expect from your ideal client. Relate to them on that level. Make sure that they appreciate who you are and what you're about. Little hints that you can drop along the way without getting into detail about it. Now, I could have said any number of different things just then when I was talking, but I was specific about being a parent, about being a sports fan, about potentially being in a boardroom scenario. Those little hints help but also the way that you talk, the language that you use, the values that you give over, absolutely critical to think about in what you're doing, because language is everything, right? If I were to speak in a very, in a manner that you might hear at a football game, then that's going to give over a very different opinion as opposed to the way that I'm talking at the moment, because I'm wanting to be clear with you and I'm wanting to show myself as an expert in this area, which I am, and I'm wanting to give you all of the information as eloquently as possible. So the next part about it is engaging with them. If you know who your ideal clients are, then seek some of them out and ask them for their opinion. Ask them for some feedback on what things might you be able to cover in future episodes of the podcast. You might already know the answers to that, but it's worthwhile checking in with them. Find out what might help them. One of the things that people often underestimate in the value of a podcast is actually that existing clients are a huge part of your audience, because the chances are that you're dealing with a person or a limited number of people, and yet the organization, or if it's a family, or doesn't matter what the scenario is, there's usually other people that are involved that don't get the opportunity to one-on-one with you. They're the people you're also speaking to, because the extra value that you add enables the people that you do correspond with to share who you are and what you're doing with them in a very generalized way. Obviously, it's not specific to their particular case, but the topics you cover relate to that. It makes you much more referable. It makes it much easier to share. It adds value to your existing audience, which again means they're more likely to share it with other people. Something absolutely want, so don't underestimate that. Engage with them, seek out their response, and respond to comments. If you are posting things on social media, if your podcast is up and running, or even if you're planning your podcast, why not ask people for their opinion? Does it mean you have to go with everything that you hear? Take it with a grain of salt. Look and see who the comments are being made by. If they tick the box of your ideal client, then better listen in and respond to them, and utilize that for a basis of where you want to go with your podcast. Now, here are some common mistakes that you need to avoid when you're looking at defining and engaging with your ideal audience. You need to understand that you cannot be everything to everybody. It's a very simple idea, but yet emotionally, we all want to make sure we're not missing anybody. We want to make sure that, oh, look, I cater for this person, this person, and this person, but I can also do that person and that brand and this thing. No, the reality is, and anyone that's had a business coach will tell you, that you need to niche. The more that you niche in terms of the way that you're speaking, the better off you are going to be. It doesn't mean you're not going to be help other people, but it just means you know who your audience is and you talk to them specifically. Don't guess, right? We talked before about making sure you actually engage with people. Don't just guess who your audience is. Take some time to work it out. Look at the reality of some of the numbers of some of the things that you are doing. What might be interesting exercise is actually to say none of your existing clients are your ideal clients. So if that's the case, fundamentally your communication needs to change to make sure you are engaging with the right people. Now, one of the other things that people make a mistake on is they fail to evolve with the audience and the market. Now, I'm going to give you an example of just how that changes. My audience today is the same people as they were 5 years ago. But 5 years ago, if I was to talk about AI, most people would not be paying attention to it. Now, if you mention AI, everybody's paying attention to it. In fact, everybody expects you to have some form of AI in your business these days. It's a very common thing to have. Now, I don't want to talk about AI here right now because that's not what it's about, but that's what an example of how the market has moved. How has it impacted what you are doing? You need to make sure that you evolve with it. You need to make sure your business evolves with it, but particularly in the way that you're engaging with the market, you need to acknowledge different market factors that have come around. There are lots of forces that change in it. If you read the paper today, it talks about interest rates maybe rising. If you read the paper, 6 months ago, it might be about interest rates going down. They have different impacts on people, on your audience. There are all sorts of factors that come into the equation. Evolve with them. Don't just let the market stay still and assume that what you were doing and what you were saying yesterday is going to work tomorrow. It may not. Okay, so we've talked about a whole bunch of different things, including some of these common mistakes that people make in this specific area. But I want to give you a little bit of an exercise. Now, we talked a little bit at the beginning about identifying your audience and naming them. Why name them? Well, I'll tell you very simply. Naming them is making them more memorable, makes them real. And it's easier to have a conversation and to sit here and go, who is the person at the other end? Now, in a previous business that I know I had a persona. I'm going to use that now as an example. And I'd given the person's name as Sharon. Now, Sharon was actually an ideal client for that business at the time. And it was not that it was exactly everything about her, but thinking about her name immediately made me think, who is it that I need to target? What is it that I need to say? What would Sharon think of what I am doing? What would Sharon think of the issues that I'm trying to address? They're the things that are important, and naming them, I think, makes it a little bit more personal and makes you think about it a little bit easily. So that's one little tip that I want to give you in that. But I also want to give you some other exercises to do. You've got to think about how they think about things. What is it that is happening in their life? What do you know about them? Write down as many things as you could possibly know about the ideal client. And I'm not just talking about the obvious things that they are the, CEO of a company that does this and does that. No, I'm talking about things about them personally that impact them. Because at the end of the day, the way to engage with your audience is to get into that emotional area, to make them relate to you, to make them want to appreciate the way you talk and the way you relate to them on different levels of things. So, for example, do they have a family? What age might their children be? What else do you know about them? What sort of car do they drive? What sort of money do they earn? You don't have to know the exact amounts of these things, but the more that you get into the psyche of who they are and what they're about, the better off you understand what might be things that they are going to relate to. And they might be in and around the periphery of what you do. They might just help with the way you tell a story. Because stories are, as I said before, the most powerful thing that you can do in a podcast is tell stories. I told a very brief story earlier on about who my ideal client is, but you can get into more specifics of things in the way that you dictate things. I gave you a story about Sharon just very briefly. Now, you might again want to get into more detail depending on the nature of the episode of the podcast you are, but you want to make it memorable for people. I often tell people the power of story is very simple. No matter who you are listening in right now, if I asked you to tell me the story of Noah's Ark, would you be able to tell it to me? The chances are, in the majority of cases, no matter where you are in the world right now, no matter what age you are, no matter what your cultural or religious background, you will be able to tell me a very similar version of the Noah's Ark story to the next person. That is the power of story. It is cross generations, it is cross cultures and religions, and there it is, a story that everybody knows. Stories are what people relate to, not how you do things. So that's a little bit of an extra bonus tip in this. So I want to make sure that you have this final exercise when you're delving into this real psyche of who these people are. Find out what influences them. Find out what resonates with them. Understand what is going to help in the way that you tell stories and the way that you relate to them on an ongoing basis. Now, if you are interested in more information, we're going to have a little bit of a download from this particular episode that will give you some details on things. So add a little bit of extra value for you. There'll be a link in the show notes on how to do that. Podcast Done For You is specifically for people who want to get their podcast up and running. And as the name suggests, it is about podcasts done for you. And we take you through a very specific exercise around persona building. It is something we do with all of our audience, and it's a little bit more detailed than what we've talked about today, but I've given you a hint, a few tips and tricks on what to do. I'm going to give you one final bonus tip because of thank you for sticking around and You might acknowledge it in the comments if you have stuck around for this particular one. And I'll put it in the download as well for you, just as a little tip. Think about wants and needs. It's a really important thing. What does your client want and what do they need? To give you an example of what the difference between those two things are, well, I need to get from point A to B, and therefore I need a car. But do I want just a basic car that's going to cost me, $5,000 secondhand car? Or do I want the expensive end of the market car that's going to feel really great, doesn't do a different job? Ultimately, it still gets me from A to B, and we still have to obey the speed limit, so it's not pitched there any faster. But do I want that versus do I need it? And you know what? People want things. They expect the need, but what they want is what you can give them. Engage with them on that emotional level. That is the differentiator. You're listening in right now because you want a podcast up and running. Well, I'll tell you this. The way to get your podcast up and running is you need to be doing nothing much towards it, because that is going to take so much of your time and energy. So why not get podcasts done for you to look after all of it for you? There's a difference between the podcasts that you need to get up and running, and some would say you want it versus you need it. I believe you do actually need it for business to be successful, so I'm going to define it that way. But do you want to really do it yourself, or do you want someone that is going to look after all of it for you? Little thought there. That was a bonus little bit. Not trying to be a sales pitch here. This is really about you. This is really about trying to understand and help you build a fantastic audience so that you can build in 2026. I want more and more podcasters out there. Someone said to me recently, it is the golden age of podcasting because the authenticity and the true voice that you get across. And if you can make yourself the expert, you become the go-to person in your field. Podcasts give in so many different ways. That's for another episode to talk about. I hope you've got something out of this. Please like, share, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We welcome your comments as well. Please let us know what you thought of this episode. And if there's something you'd like us to cover in future episodes, always love engaging with my audience, because that's what it is, defining and engaging your audience so you can speak to them directly in 2026. Hope you've got something out of this. Until next time, this is Podcast Done For You, the show.